Uh, Good morning, Professor Wallace.
Good morning.
Thank you for taking the time to answer some questions about Picasso and Van Gogh.
Sure.
Are you familiar with Starry Night?
Yes.
What do you think about Starry Night?
Well, I think that it's quite a remarkable work of art, and I've had the good fortune of seeing it in person several times at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it's an incredibly emotional piece that is very inspiring to me as an artist, but then also just as a viewer. There's something about it, its rhythm, its use of swirling lines and imagery, that has just sort of a dreamlike almost feeling to it, that I find very soothing, very calming.
And what about The Beggar by Picasso?
Yes, I'm familiar with that piece as well.
What do you think about that picture?
It's full of melancholy. The colors that are used, the depiction of the man himself is very heartfelt. I think that it is a very strong emotional picture and affects you on a very sort of visceral kind of level.
Okay, that is good. That is good. Picasso. Okay, now what the use of blue? This is the reason why I picked those two pictures. I like the way that Picasso and Van Gogh use blue. How do you think? What do you think about their uses of blue in those two pictures?
Well, they're different, I would say. In the Van Gogh picture, it is more of a naturalistic depiction, in that I think that the blue is meant to represent the night sky, and it's a comforting sort of blue. It's a blue that we're familiar with, whereas the blue in the Picasso picture has been desaturated. It's washed out. It's it gives a much more sort of destitute or sort of feeling because of the way that the tones have been neutralized or sort of grayed out, and it has a much different emotional resonance for that reason.
Okay, thank you. What do you think about Picasso's blue period and what it meant to him and us?
Well, I think that he was attempting to create a certain kind of mood and feeling across a series of pictures, depicting sort of human want, loneliness, sadness, emotions that could be conveyed with sort of the blues. That idea, I think, because blue isn't always a melancholy color, but the way that he depicted it really creates a sense of strong emotion, and I think that that reflected something in his inner character that he was trying to express. There is something to be said that, like, every painting is something of a self-portrait, so I think that some of those emotions certainly must have come from, Picasso's own inner self, and in terms of how it affects us or what it means to us, I think even today, some 100-odd years removed from when those pictures were made, there's still a feeling of sadness that's pervasive in those pictures that affects us today. The issues that he was dealing with, human loneliness, depression, homelessness, joblessness. The topics.
Picasso went through that?
Well, no, I think that those topics, though, that he covers in those paintings in the blue period, we still relate to and understand today.
Yes, sir. Did Van Gogh have a parallel period or a blue period or any type of thing like that?
Well, his early works were before he became a really colorful painter, his early works were very traditional, and I guess I would say he almost went through sort of a brown period. His work was very dark, moody, gloomy, and not nearly as bright and animated as we think of the sort of, Van Gogh that everyone knows from Sunflowers or, pictures of fields, his portraits.
Okay. Thank you. Van Gogh's post-impression. How would you define Van Gogh's post-impression era or time?
It was a time of transition, essentially. The post-impressionists were reacting against the impressionist art that had come before, in some ways as a negative reaction, wanting to avoid that sort of style or subject matter, but then in other ways embracing, I think, the breakthrough of Impressionism. Van Gogh in particular, though, I think was just a very idiosyncratic artist. He kind of followed his own path, and certainly had influences that informed his work, but I would say that he was truly kind of a singular artist in that regard, compared to some of the other post-impressionists.
Okay, thank you. What do you think about the differences between Van Gogh's and Picasso's social lives?
Well, I would say that in terms of the kind of people that they were very different. Van Gogh was very insular, quiet, didn't easily make friends, very socially reserved, religiously conservative, and it was difficult, I think, for him to form human relationships, whereas Picasso was kind of the opposite. He was sort of a social sponge, and was very outgoing, had a very high opinion of himself and his own work, whereas Van Gogh was a much more humble person. If to all accounts, Picasso was kind of a brash, cocky sort of person.
With entourages and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And embraced fame and celebrity in a way that Van Gogh never had the opportunity to, because his work, never really sold during his lifetime.
Well, I know we're only comparing Van Gogh. Right now we're comparing Van Gogh and Picasso. But is there any other artist that rivaled Picasso in his fame and
for his era, I would say probably not. Maybe Henri Matisse, in terms of critical reception and sales. Although I don't think that he embraced celebrity quite the same way that Picasso did. The one person that I would compare to Picasso, I guess, in terms of celebrity status, the various modes in which they worked, and having an incredible amount of output as an artist would be Andy Warhol.
I thought the same thing. When I was asking you the question, I thought about Andy Warhol.
Okay,
but I think that would you agree that Picasso set the standard for celebrity artists?
Yes, I think so. I think that he was kind of created that sort of cult of personality in the 20th century that elevated an artist beyond just sort of art world status to kind of larger cultural status.
Okay, thank you. Did Van Gogh commit suicide or was he murdered?
Well, I recently read a book that explained that new evidence had come to light that he was accidentally shot and murdered, and covered it up so as to protect the young children who had perpetrated the crime against him. But apparently, because of the entry point of the gunshot wound, and sort of the way in which he actually passed, it would have been impossible for him to shoot himself at that particular angle. And then there's other anecdotal evidence that suggests that he kind of covered up the crime to protect the children who accidentally shot him. It would have been against Van Gogh's nature to commit suicide because of his strict religious upbringing. He would have considered that a cardinal sin. It's not something it would have been in his character, in my opinion.
Okay. Now, as an artist, have you sold more than one painting?
Yeah, I have. I've been fortunate to sell more than one painting.
So what do you think about the fact that Van Gogh only sold one picture? Is it because he couldn't part with his work, or was it because his work wasn't sought after? I think that
his work was just ahead of its time to a certain extent. People weren't quite ready for the bright colors, the expressive use of the materials, and I think it was also his own personality made it very difficult for him to deal with potential patrons or people who might be interested in buying his work. He bartered his work a lot. He would trade it to be able to afford to live, or for supplies, or for food. For alcohol. unfortunately for alcohol, because he was an alcoholic. But I think it was kind of a combination of things. His work was ahead of its time, and also his abrasive personality, I think, made it difficult for people to, want to pursue him as patrons.
Okay. Now, Picasso and Van Gogh had different social lives. Is it true that they both experienced depression?
From what I understand, yes, that is true. Certainly with Van Gogh, it's pretty well documented that he, suffered from what we would probably think of as bipolar disorder today, or manic depression. And with Picasso, I would say it was more of not necessarily depression, but like sort of a brooding personality, an obsessive personality. But maybe not necessarily what we would think of today as like a depressive disorder.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think I have 2 more questions.
Okay.
What do you know about the women of Picasso and Van Gogh?
Well, Van Gogh's women would mostly have been people that he was depicting that he had some kind of personal relationship with, but they were not necessarily objects of desire. Whereas in Picasso's realm, he certainly painted all of the women in his life, and I actually saw a really interesting exhibition one time in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Picasso's Weeping Women, and it was about how you could sort of follow the progress of, in portraiture, of his sort of tumultuous relationship with each woman that he was involved with. And they would start off as pictures where they were depicted as sort of beautiful, smiling, bright colors, and then eventually they all ended up being in a picture where they were crying, their faces broken apart, almost kind of monster-like. And so he sort of lived his relationships through his art to a certain extent. That content of his personal life was definitely in his artwork.
Do you think that that was part of his appeal?
I think that in a way that it was, that whether people were aware of it or not, that the honesty with which he depicts the subjects, even in his abstracted style, is, I think, something that people could relate to. I don't want to say appeal, because the pictures aren't necessarily appealing, pictures of weeping women, but that there was a certain amount of autobiography in there that I think that people were interested in.
Yes, sir. Okay, do you have a favorite between Picasso and Van Gogh?
Oh, wow. I guess it'd be hard to choose. I like them both for different reasons. I would probably say that if I had to choose one over the other, I would choose Picasso.
Really? That's interesting, because I like Van Gogh. Okay. Because because Van Gogh, I think that there's a little bit of Picasso in me and a little bit of Van Gogh in me. And I've been solitaire, and I just kind of like, my heart goes out to Van Gogh. Yes. A little bit more.
Absolutely. I think on a personal level, I relate more to Van Gogh than to Picasso, like as a human being.
Yes, sir.
Artistically, I would say that Van Gogh's path was so singular that his influence is hard to absorb without it just being something of a ripoff, maybe, of Van Gogh. Whereas Picasso's work is so varied and so diverse that he's a little bit easier to absorb as an influence as an artist, I think. But certainly as a man, I am less respectful than I am of what Van Gogh sort of represented or endured in his lifetime.
Well, Professor, thank you very much. Just one last thing. Could you please look into the camera and tell just a brief, history of yourself, and, where you went to school, and, how you love art, and, anything like that?
Sure. My name is Scott Wallace, and I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in fine art. I got my bachelor's degree from Coker College in Hartsville, South Carolina, and then my graduate degree from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in Chicago, Illinois. I'm primarily an abstract painter, but my work veers back and forth between abstraction and realism. And I am currently working on a series of illustrations and drawings kind of derived from personal content, and setting up a new studio in my new house, which I'm very excited about.
That sounds exciting. It's very exciting.
It is.
Well, thank you very much. If you just hit that close button.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Sure, no problem. My pleasure.
Well,